Just to let everyone know that we are recording this session and we're also live streaming it onto YouTube. So if you need to watch it later, you can find it on our YouTube channel as well. So I think we are ready to start. Apologies for that. The live stream started in the background, so we can start now. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar on how to write a journal article. Our speakers today are Jessica Lipowski, who is publishing editor on the STM Journals editorial. She manages a range of journals, working with editors and societies to develop new strategies and problem solve. During her time at Sage, she has also worked closely with the author team to create and develop resources to help early career researchers better understand the publishing process and publish their research. She is based at our Sage headquarters in California. Today we also have Дженнифер Ловик, who is managing editor 3 in the Open Access Journals team at Sage Publishing in Thousand Oaks, California. She received her PhD in molecular cell and developmental biology from UCLA in 2015 and joined Sage Publishing in 2016. Jennifer is the executive editor of the Open Access Journal Technology in Cancer Research and Treatment and manages a small team of in-house managing editors that serve as executive editors of several open access journals, Cancer Control, Science Progress, and Neuroscience Insights. Jennifer is also involved in a variety of in-house projects that focus on marketing, peer review, and research ethics. We also have Mohammed Nadim Aslam, MBBS, MD, who is an assistant research scientist in the Department of Pathology at the University of Michigan. Dr. Aslam was trained as a physician in Pakistan before moving on to a research career in the United States. He is involved in translational research related to colon health with a focus on colorectal cancer, chemoprevention, and improving the gut barrier. He is also serving as editor of the prevention section of the Cancer Control Sage Publishing editorial board. And finally, there's me, Maria Tissot. I am marketing manager in the author marketing team at Sage. And my focus is on helping researchers who are in the early stages of their career get published. I am based in Sage's London office. Our session today will last about 40 minutes with 20 minutes reserved at the end for questions. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function on Zoom and we will try to answer as many as we can. If we are unable to answer your question during this session, do not worry, we will get back to you with an answer after the presentation. I will now hand over to Jessica.
Thank you so much, Maria, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. Really excited to have you be a part of this webinar. So this chart provides a timeline of the typical author journey, moving from the early stages of securing funding all the way through peer review and publication. So today we're focusing on how to write your article. We covered this in the last webinar, so we'll go briefly through this, but before you get started writing, you'll want to focus on who is going to be interested, because millions of journal articles are published each year. So asking yourself these questions will really help you get started. How does your manuscript and your research build on what we already know? How significant is your message? Have you gone through your methodology and double-checked your work? Is your work novel and innovative, or is it reproducing already published work to help? Maybe it's extending a theory or filling a gap in the current research that is out there. What will it contribute to your field? So once you've answered these questions, this will really help you identify your target audience and who you're writing for. Take time to get started, because writing, as we all know, can take a lot of time. So block out time in your schedule to brainstorm. Ensure you have all of your materials, research, and data gathered in front of you. And then read current journal articles in your field of study. So what we're covering here today is a high-level overview, and of course, much of this will be tailored to your particular discipline or field of research. So look to those other journal articles in your field of study. Perhaps find an experienced writer or a mentor to help you with this. We have a future webinar on mentorship coming up. And then take time to provide an outline and organize your manuscript before you even get started. And as a reminder, we have fantastic resources on the Sage Author Gateway that you can reference, including Sage Author Services. You'll also want to be leaning on your co-authors for help and support as you begin this writing process. So with that in mind, it's important to think about who you should name as an author. Authorship does consist of 4 criteria. Authors will have made a substantial contribution to the concept or design of the work, or helped with the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data. They also helped draft the article or revised it significantly for the intellectual content, which is what we're focusing on today. So how to actually write that manuscript. And then they'll approve that final version, and then they could have participated sufficiently in the work to take public responsibility for what you are publishing. If there's anyone else involved, but maybe don't meet all of these criteria, you can and should list them in the acknowledgement section. So the reason we bring this up today is, even though the focus is on writing a manuscript, all authors should be involved in the writing component as well. So maybe not in drafting the entire document, but providing feedback, revisions, and oversight, as well as approving the final version you ultimately submit and publish. Before we even dive into the overall structure, just wanted to cover some basic file formats. So you can submit a manuscript and start drafting your manuscript in Microsoft Word, which is fairly straightforward. Within Word itself, make sure your heading levels are clear and your sections are clearly defined. And you'll want to check those author submission guidelines to see if there's any specific formatting requirements. LaTeX is also another file format that you can use. LaTeX is a document preparation system, and these files are most often used to produce technical and scientific documents. And this is because it's easier to format things like equations, and it can handle non-Roman alphabets, bibliographies, and formulaic drawings. So the learning curve is a little bit steeper than, say, Microsoft Word, but once you learn the basics, LaTeX can really save you a lot of time. And then you have .bib or .bst files that have the bibliographic references that you might want to use. So just wanted to cover some basics there. I'm going to turn this over to Jennifer and Nadim to talk about the article structure.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Maria, for the kind introduction. So when we talk about the article structure, the first thing obviously is title. The interesting thing is, title is the first thing you look at when you publish, but you don't have to write the title first. You have to write the manuscript first, and then you can, based on your complete story, you pick a title. So it should be short, eye-catching, to the point, unique. And titles usually gives the first impression of the whole story. It can enhance searchability and engage your readers from the start, so much so that it can impact the everlasting success of your article. Title has to be brief, as most of the journals always have a word limit for it. And in addition to the main title, sometimes journal also ask for a short title, which usually appears as a header on the published article on individual pages. And then, as Jessica mentioned, authorship is an honor, especially for the young investigators, graduate students, and postdocs. People always remember their first published article. As you know, we all know that's the special place in your heart for that article. Always make sure that your name is spelled correctly when we talk about the author detail, because that's on the title page, you have a title and then your authors, your name, affiliation, and often included on a separate page for anonymized review, blinded review. And when we talk about your name, it should be complete in a way. You don't want to present in a different way each time you publish. The reason, if you continue to change your full name for each publication, databases like PubMed may not recognize you as the same author. And that's why journals have started using a service called ORCID, O-R-C-I-D, Open Researcher and Contributor ID, a digital ID to identify authors. For that, you have to register with the ORCID services. So I will hand over to Jen for her, further talking about abstract.
Thank you so much, Nadine. And thank you, Jessica and Maria, for the warm and kind introduction. So as Nadine said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the abstract and the keywords. So the abstract is a brief summary of your article, and after the title is the first part of the article that people read. The abstract is much easier to write after the article is written, much like writing the title is easier to write after the article has been written. The abstract should be short, usually no more than 250 words. And the title and abstract are what is shared with potential reviewers in peer review. If the title and abstract are easy to read and clearly outline what the manuscript is about, reviewers will be more likely to agree to review your manuscript and reduce the time the manuscript spends in peer review. Also, as the abstract is the first introduction the article has once it's published, a really well-written abstract may also increase the likelihood of someone reading it and also citing the article. I hand it back to Nadine.
Okay, to continue with the article structure. So there are, as you sit down to write manuscript, typically follow a certain article structure. The outline we highlight here is most common for all the scientific journals, but the journal you are submitting to will have the appropriate structure you should follow in their manuscript submission guidelines. Usually there are 5 main sections authors should cover while writing original research or full-length article. We'll go over these sections one by one. You can see there are a number of questions you can answer while covering these sections to complete your story. So for introduction, there's some set of questions. For material and method, there's another set of questions. Results, there's another set of questions. So similarly, discussion and conclusion, you kind of address the answers based on all the questions you raised in your previous sections. So the introduction, you should identify a clear, compelling statement of purpose. In addition, it might cover a short literature review. The introduction should detail the subject and aim of the article, as well as discuss research questions, hypotheses, and the conceptual framework. The literature review, sometimes part of the introduction, and sometimes its own section, summarizes the theories you are applying to your research and connects these theories to lay the groundwork for your study. Be sure to position yourself in the ongoing debate on the topic. This is often a comment given by the reviewers. And when we talk about, hypothesis, so you question, what was the hypothesis you want to prove? What did you research and what is the conceptual framework behind it? So introduction moves from broad topic to narrow. So it comes down to it, focus, providing a background to known and unknown information in the field, gaps in the field, and narrows down to your main question or hypothesis and your final approach. It is an ongoing statement. You are trying to make your case, and it sets up the stage for readers what you are trying to come from and what is your story. Why a method experiment was selected and how the results answer the questions. So once you set up a stage in your introduction, you move on to the next section, which is methodology. Some journals have this methodology right after introduction, and few journals have at the end of the discussion or even after references. But regardless, the methodology section should be clear, meaningful, answerable, interrelated, and flow logically from the introduction. As this section implies, you should discuss the methodology used and how the study was conducted. There should be enough information present in the terms of the procedures and our measures of the readers to trust the data or to produce it. It is important to include any relevant material or method used, including ethical approval you needed to acquire, especially for human studies or animal studies. Some common subsections include participants, instrumentation, procedures, analytical techniques, and so on, so forth. So what did you do? What was your technique? It is important to include any relevant material or method used, including ethical approval you needed to acquire and informed consent procedure followed. Do you do your best to mention the company or organization where materials were obtained for the reproducibility and to build trust with readers? Have you used an appropriate sample? How did you prepare your samples? How did you select them? Do the procedure measures offer enough information for reproducibility, replicability, trust? How did you collect the data? Did you use appropriate statistical methods? That will answer your sample size, future study sample size. Be sure to cite methods used by others. This can be missed and can cause ethical concerns. Include information around the motivation for your choices. Why did you choose this method over potential methods used by other investigators? So, and then the analysis and discussion will follow. In the results section, authors share their data. The data are characters around which you develop the story, while the text is the story. There are facts, numbers, observations, usually presented in tables and figures as raw data. It helps you have tables and figures at the speed's comprehension. Results are statements in the text that interpret or explain what the data show. Authors usually make a mistake by offering the readers data but don't provide results. Means they don't provide interpretation of the data. So to summarize this, the results section discusses the key findings, while discussion covers what the results mean. The discussion section provides as you guessed it, discussion about what the results mean, connecting them back to the literature, back to the question you raised in your introduction. Also included are limitations and the future directions. Finally, the conclusion brings awareness to the limitation and does not go beyond the evidence. It might even outline future studies needed. Let's go back to the writing desk. The easiest place to start after finishing an outline, as Jessica mentioned in the method section, and then the results section usually follows next, because this is just a presentation of one's finding. No deep analysis is needed yet. Build the manuscript by then dividing into this discussion, literature review, introduction sections to frame the research finding. The abstract and the concluding paragraph are statement that encapsulates the rest of the sections are usually the last two pieces composed. Allow enough time to write a draft and work with others in the team who are experienced to help develop the manuscript further. Start by organizing data into the figures that tells the story that you want. This forms the structure of the results section, and everything builds around that. Of course, not all papers have figures, but the same logic can be applied to looking at your research findings. Use them to create the research story you want to tell, you want to share. Let's say an author is doing empirical work, focusing on the application of a theory within a context. Journal requires the author to make a theoretical contribution or advance the theory in my line of study. We always consider the application of a theory to a study's hypothesis an important way to advance that theory, to continue testing the veracity of the theory in the real world practice, and perhaps even to enhance or adapt the intervention or research question. This is usually done in the introduction or sometimes in the intervention section of the paper. Ideally, you would return to the theory in your discussion and describe whether your research fully or partially ratifies the theory or refutes the theory, your discussion could also reflect on how your finding could be used to adapt the theory to make it more relevant. In a nutshell, the discussion is the last opportunity for you to convince your readers about your case you're trying to make, like making a closing argument in a courtroom. You remind them what were the questions, how you did it, and share the existing information. Provide your results, particularly unexpected ones, or even the negative ones, and offer the interpretation of your data and close it with the significance and importance of your work. It would be good to highlight study's strengths and weaknesses at the end. End this whole discussion with a concluding remark. A poorly written story can hide even the best science you have conducted so far. Make sure to connect the components of the story together from introduction to discussion with experiments and results in the middle. I will hand over to Jen with her experience. She will kind of conclude this whole point I'm trying to make.
Yep. Thank you, Nadeem. So there is when thinking about peer review of an article, there is a high likelihood of reviewers asking for reasons why you chose specific methods or study approaches. And they may also just ask questions for more clarity around the methods and why you chose those and how it relates to the results. So having really clear detailed methods sections and a really clear connection between the results and the methods chosen is very helpful, not just for readers, but also for really good peer review by the reviewers and also editors. So I think in my experience, it's been really helpful if authors specify the reasons why certain methods were chosen or study approaches were used up front, and it's very clear in the materials and methods, and then also providing sufficient rationale for why those methods were chosen, and this includes relevant references. And so when again it comes to the actual peer review of an article, this should reduce the likelihood of reviewers asking a lot of questions, asking for explanations, and should help a manuscript get through peer review more quickly. And it's also just really relevant and useful too for readers if they want to, not just better understand how you did your study, but also if they want to reproduce it. So the last part of this is going to cover acknowledgements, statements, and declarations, the references, and supporting materials. So someone does not count as an author if they have participated solely in the acquisition of funding, collection of data, and general supervision of the research group. However, if there are contributors who have done one or more of these things, but do not meet the criteria for authorship, then they can and should be listed in the acknowledgement section. The inclusion of detailed ethics approval and informed consent statements is a fundamental requirement for biomedical research articles. At the initial review stage in peer review, there is a check to see that appropriate ethics approval and informed consent statements have been provided by the authors in the manuscript. If these things are missing or they're incomplete, very often articles or manuscripts will be sent back to the authors. The manuscript may not move forward to peer review right away, or additional information might be requested at the first revision. So providing this information at submission does reduce the likelihood of a manuscript being sent back or rejected up front, and also spending more time going back and forth in revisions. It's also really important to state if you have any conflicts of interest or funding up front. If you have nothing to disclose, it's really good to state that as well. The same is true for ethics approval and consent statements. If you didn't have a study that required approval or patient or participant consent, go ahead and state you didn't need it and why. In the medical fields, there are some additional requirements, so it's always good to check journal manuscript submission guidelines when preparing your manuscript. And if relevant, provide relevant reporting checklists for your study type. These are found in the Equator Wizard website. And then you can also provide a copy of a completed reporting checklist, which shows what changes you made and what pages they appear on. You can include this as a supplemental file with your submission. When it comes to formatting your references, be sure to check the reference style followed by your chosen journal. Harvard, Vancouver, and APA reference styles are commonly used. Other styles available for certain journals are ACS Style Guide, AMA Manual of Style, ASA Style Guide, Chicago Manual of Style, and CSE Manual for Authors, Editors, and Societies. If you're submitting a paper directly from a preprint server, such as Sage's Advanced, make sure that the formatting in the file type is correct and properly anonymized where appropriate. We often hear people ask if they are more likely to have their paper accepted if they cite literature previously published in the journal. The short answer is no, this is not necessarily true. The bigger issue at hand is that the reference list should be comprehensive and relevant. It is always good to have recent literature within the last 5 years or so be a good portion of the references. Reviewers get concerned if there aren't recent references, especially when they do exist. It is good to reference other papers published in the journal which you would like to submit, though obviously not too many, but this shows that your research is somewhat related to that journal's aims and scope. However, it is not compulsory and will not necessarily increase the chances of your article being published. We take great care to advise editors and reviewers not to make judgments about a paper based on personal, financial, or intellectual biases or any other considerations. The quality of the research and written presentation of the paper are paramount. Our editors are also committed to maintaining and promoting consistent ethical policies for their journal. Also, as most journals have word and figure limits, it's good to consider supplemental materials. These can be a great way to illustrate your research. For instance, you can have video or audio files that cannot be printed in a journal, but are interactive elements to host alongside your article online. They also increase visibility of a published article. I hand it back to Nadine.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Quite a bit of information. Thank you for sharing all that information. So moving on, I think we will switch gears here, and I think from the article structure, we will boils down this discussion to writing style, because that's what matters when you are writing for a scientific journal or for any journal. So authors should use an academic writing style. For example, write in a consistent person and tense that was appropriate for their field, be specific as possible, and avoid generalization, as well as avoid colloquialism and formal phrases and slangs. Try to also avoid regional or discipline-specific jargon. Journal improvement on language quality are appreciated. Choose your terminology and nomenclature carefully. Some aspects to consider: active voice over passive voice, concise language, simpler sentence construction, correct article use, and singular versus plural agreement of verbs and nouns. The articles should be cohesive. The cohesiveness is very important for your story. You have to connect it from the section 1 to the last section. So article should be cohesive and consistent in its overall organization and flow of the manuscript. The manuscript should use a balance of tools like transitions and parallel constructions. What you discuss in your introduction or pointed out in your introduction, you should connecting that question in result section and comes back and provide a conclusion to the same question. So the research questions and findings should be clearly stated, and you should correctly use headers to make it obvious for the readers. Journals expect bias-free, inclusive language that is appropriate for a global audience. Authors should take care when writing about gender, age, disability, neurodiversity, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and religion. They should be sensitive to the labels and those should be appropriately specific. They should keep in mind that people can have many identities, and one shared identity does not necessarily mean shared experiences. It is worth stating here that bias-free inclusive research goes beyond word choice and extend to the assumptions made by the researchers and the intention and design of the study, for example, the sampling. If the reviewers has concern with any of this, it should be noted in the review. Having an academic writing style is not always intuitive. It can be challenging, even daunting when you start out, especially when English is not your first language. And I can declare that I'm not in the same boat. English is not my first language. While you are working to improve your writing skills, we encourage you to use any services available to you through the publisher or your institution. You can use English language editing services or an editor to help you with language quality and writing style. Sage also offers these Sage author services to help with the language editing and formatting. One common advice by the writing experts to the new scientific writer: practice, practice, and practice. It will make you perfect and make you better in writing. And I think a writing style makes easier for a reader to follow your story. Thank you so much. I will hand over back to Jessica.
Okay. Thank you, Nadeem, and thank you for sharing also your experiences with the importance of writing style. I couldn't agree more. Practice, practice, practice. So now I'm going to switch gears as well and talk a little bit more about sort of the overall big points to consider when actually constructing your manuscript. So the first is to talk more about reporting guidelines. Review reporting guidelines by your study type. Granted, not all study types or article types have reporting guidelines, so it's important to know which ones do and which ones don't. I do recommend going to the Equator Network website. They have an Equator wizard, which you can actually steps you through a series of questions to find out what your study type is and if there's a relevant reporting guidelines and checklist to follow. This is really helpful when actually constructing the article because they have a lot of really good points about things to make sure you include and where to include them in the article. So that's just really helpful to double check that and follow the items listed in the relevant reporting guidelines. Also, depending on the journal, it might not be a requirement that all articles make significant or especially novel contributions to the field. However, at the minimum, most journals do expect the findings to be clear on what the contribution of the research is, because it is difficult for future research to build on a study that lacks clear findings and limitations. Next, we expect research to have appropriate ties to the literature. The literature review is what builds out the theoretical framework of the study. Summarize the theories you're applying to your research and connect these theories to lay the groundwork for your study. Typically, in the literature review, you are not introducing any new information about your own study, but are weaving together information from prior research and studies that inherently shows that your research, studies design, and methodology is grounded in theory. The most important thing is that you show how your investigation builds upon and contributes to existing scholarly work and theoretical development. Editors and reviewers generally expect to see a theory or theories presented in the literature review to support the rationale for the investigation. This section details the kind of work that has already been done in the field or in similar studies. More on the literature review. So most editors and reviewers do expect to see both a concise targeted literature review as well as an explanation of the most relevant theories that uphold your research question and or intervention approach. Neglecting to include a theory could be taken as an indication the research question is relatively ungrounded and perhaps even speculative. So the introduction is not the place to offer a primer on the theories being used, but editors and reviewers do expect you to give a brief summary of the theory or theories that relates to your study and a few well-chosen seminal references that direct the reader to where they can learn more. The most important thing is that you show how your investigation builds upon and contributes to existing scholarly work and theoretical development. Editors and reviewers expect to see a theory or theories presented in the literature review to support the rationale for the investigation. They then expect you to return to the theory or theories in the discussion, conclusion, and next steps sections. Lastly, a common critique that a journal appreciates are issues with figure legends. So make sure your figures are easy to read and clearly labeled. The figure legend should also be detailed enough to explain the figure so that a reader does not need to immediately refer to the results section for additional information. When it comes to looking at methods and data analysis, there are a number of key items to focus on. The first is the study design. Make sure there are no concerns with the way in which the study was conducted. Is the study design common for the type of study conducted? Are the experiments and methodology used common for the field or novel to the field? If they are novel to the field, there may be need to additional explanation as to why the methods chosen were used. Is the material and method section descriptive enough so that the study could be reproduced? This includes items like describing the procedure or methods followed, or using a literature reference to refer to the procedure if it's already been used elsewhere. Also including critical steps that are unique to the study. Examples are dilutions of antibodies that were used in your specific experiments in your study. Also including the catalog numbers and company names of the reagents and equipment that were used. Also, are the statistical techniques relevant to this study? Are they standard for that kind of study? And are the materials and methods used for the study appropriate for the research question being addressed? A lot of the questions raised in analyzing the materials and methods section flow over into the results, discussion, and conclusion sections. Common questions to think about include, are the results presented in a way that best emphasize the findings? Are these sections free of unsupported generalizations or assumptions? Are the conclusions appropriate for the study? And are there appropriate limitations and directions for future research? A lot of these questions are really good to be thinking about as you write a paper, because they are also very common questions that editors and reviewers might ask during peer review. So I'm going to now hand over to Jessica.
Thank you. There's a lot of great information to digest here. And I know the questions are rolling in. We're really excited to dig into them shortly. Just a few more points. As you're writing, so as you're going through and structuring your article, you'll want to think about how to help readers find your article. Google and Google Scholar have established themselves as the first port of call for researchers today, as well as other indices. And so, for example, just to give perspective, Google accounts for 60% of referral traffic to the Sage Journals platform. So it's of paramount importance to make sure that your article can be easily found in search engines, and particularly Google's or others like Bing and Yahoo. So if no one's reading your findings, what is the use of disseminating your research and ultimately publishing? So search engines look at the abstract page of your article, which is free for everyone to view on the Sage Journals platform, and on many other publishers' websites as well. So as Jen and Nadim mentioned, your website or your abstract is not only the sales pitch that tempts the reader into reading and downloading your article, it also gives search engines all the data they need to find your article and rank it in the search results page. So while you might add this later into the writing process, it's helpful to think about your end reader before you even start writing, so you can think about what vocabulary and phrases you might need to incorporate into your document, into your manuscript. So think about who will ultimately be reading the paper in the end. We will be covering this in a future webinar, so I wanted to briefly skim through how to present various data. For quantitative studies, data can be really complex to understand, so it is important that it be presented clearly, and there's many, many different ways that you can present data, including text, tables, graphics, figures, equations, statistics, you name it. So to use data effectively and really trust the results, we need to understand where it came from, how it was defined, and the context in which it was collected, just to name a few of the points. So with quantitative studies, we can present results in an informative way. Demographic data describes the sample, is usually presented first. You can remind the reader of the research question being addressed. You'll want to state which differences are significant, highlight any important trends and differences or comparisons, and then within that presentation, whether the hypothesis is supported or not. So figures and tables may not be required depending on the article type that you're working on, but be sure to check the author guidelines and think about the type of research that you're presenting. Most often for original research, you will have some kind of data presentation. For experimental studies, results are almost always presented separately from the discussion, and this is best illustrated in tables and figures. So you can use the text to introduce those tables and figures and guide the researcher through to the key results. Again, you'll want to point out those differences and relationships, providing additional information as necessary. And you might be including any negative results or null findings, and then you can explain those findings within the discussion section. For qualitative studies, qualitative data is difficult to present neatly in tables and figures, so this is often expressed in words, which could result in a large quantity of written material through which you must guide your reader. So structuring your analysis well is therefore very important. So you'll want to make your sections and subsections clearly reflect the themes that have emerged from the analysis of the data, and make sure your reader understands how these themes evolved. So headings and subheadings, directions will be crucial and can really be a form of signposting to make these chapters easier to navigate. Consistent and deliberate choices for terminology and nomenclature is often laid out in the introduction, but then the discussion often includes presentation of the existing or ongoing debate. So you can take that how you will. Tables are the preferred format when presenting data in research documents. The column and row structure allows readers to easily navigate, compare, evaluate, and understand that data. Graphs allow you to present data visually and emphasize the important points, so you don't need to spend as much time on lengthy text explanations. Graphs are really great for showing trends that may not be as clear in tables, and there's many, many different types of graphs that can be used. A well-constructed graph should have a title, figure legend, and footnotes along with the figure, and the title should be concise yet informative. And then you'll want to make sure you'll have captions and headings that provide further explanation as needed. Back over to you, Jen.
Thank you. So spend a little bit here talking about image editing and quality. Illustrations, pictures, and graphs should be supplied electronically in the highest quality formats when you submit for peer review, so that they'll be the best possible resource for your article. And also, it really helps out reviewers and editors if they are higher quality, higher resolution images to look at for review. Different publishers will have different technical specifications for visuals as supplemental material, so be sure to thoroughly check journals' manuscript submission guidelines. Images supplied in color will not usually be reformatted, so you should make sure the colors are exactly how you wish them to appear if your article is accepted and published. Also, try to keep edits on images down. Figures should be minimally processed and should reflect the integrity of the original data in the image. For instance, images should not be layered or combined into a single image unless it's stated that the figure is a product of time average data. Adjustments to images in brightness, contrast, or color balance should be applied equally to the entire image, provided they do not distort any data in the figure, including the background. Selective adjustments and touch-up tools used on portions of a figure are not appropriate. Keep notes of the changes you are making, so you can always be transparent if an editor or future researcher calls a figure into question. All adjustments to images should be clearly disclosed in the figure legend. Images may be additionally screened to confirm faithfulness to the original data during peer review, so just be aware of that. And also, authors should be able to supply raw image data upon request from editors. Authors should also list tools and software used to collect image data and should document settings and manipulations in the methods section. Ensure that any images you have taken from elsewhere are referenced properly and that you secure the proper permissions to use any images that are under copyright. We will be touching on this in more detail in a future webinar. So once you decide which journal you'd like to submit to, spend some time reading the manuscript submission guidelines for that particular journal and follow them. We cannot emphasize enough how much editors appreciate the effort you put in. If you do not follow the guidelines, there's a large chance your paper might be unsubmitted and sent back for adjustments before even being considered for peer review. Also, consider looking at articles from the journal you're interested in as a reference for formatting, structure, and writing style. As you're getting ready to submit, just like you did with writing, make every effort to improve the quality of your manuscript and try to be objective about your work. Write for that journal's particular audience. Read the aims and scope and tailor your manuscript accordingly. Make sure to include in your submission funding, conflict of interest, and ethics statements, even if you have nothing to declare. You may even want to consider creating a visual or graphical abstract to help with promotion and understanding by the public. When in doubt, reach out to the journal editorial office for advice if your manuscript might be a good fit. You can send over your abstract and a brief outline to help the editor determine if it may be a good fit. Please note, though, that this does not guarantee acceptance.
You're getting so close and you're almost ready. But as we've been mentioning, the submission guidelines really tell you what the editor wants included, as well as any relevant information about how to structure the text, use headings appropriately, and present your material. So while we've covered a lot of information here today, and that's a general overview, and particularly for original research, there's many variations for your own discipline, your own field of study, and a particular article type, like a brief report. Brief report might be structured differently than original research. So when you're checking the journal specific requirements, you can look at things like word limits, the article structure, the reference style, is that APA, Harvard, AMA, guidance on the title, abstract, and keywords. You might be required to submit keywords from that particular journal's keyword list, or maybe you can add your own. You'll want to make sure that your documents are properly anonymized for either single anonymous or double anonymous peer review, if applicable. You might need to prepare a cover letter. All of these things we'll be diving into again in future topics, because we could spend hours talking about all of this. So as we've also mentioned, you might want to rely on an editor, a mentor, or an English language service as needed to help with formatting or editing, like our Sage author services. Consider supplemental material, like Jen mentioned, as well as make sure you've obtained all appropriate permissions on any copyrighted material, if applicable. Perhaps your paper had already been presented at a conference. Most of the time that is okay, but check the journal's specific guidelines to see if there might be any challenges with that. And just some common mistakes to avoid. I know we covered this as well, but it's possible editors might not even take a look at a manuscript for several reasons. This might be incorrect formatting of tables and figures. Maybe they don't accept a particular manuscript type. Maybe it's out of scope of the journal, so it doesn't make sure to read the aims and scopes, that it falls within the relevant research or study. And then if it's not able to be read, so looking at the grammar, the syntax, you'll want to make sure that you have done your due diligence in editing before submitting to the appropriate journal. Best practice is to submit to one journal at a time. You'll send that in via the online manuscript submission system. Sage uses ScholarOne manuscripts, what we call Sage Track, and then you'll follow the steps outlined in the platform. With that, we want to make sure we leave enough time for questions, but stay tuned for the next webinar on August 24th, where we look at mentorship. So how to find a mentor and what to look for in that relationship. And that's specifically regarding the writing process and the publishing process. So we'll have an open forum on that, as well as upcoming topics. This is the rest of the 2022 program. In 2023, we'll be digging into things like how to write a cover letter, image integrity, and additional details on authorship and etiquette. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Maria, to help us digest some of the questions that we've received.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to our speakers today for this really informative presentation. We've had loads of questions, and I don't think we're going to be able to cover them all. But as I said earlier, if we can answer questions today, we will follow up with you by email. So do look out for those. So I will start. Let me just find the questions, 1 second. So there was a question about how do we link conceptual work, framework and theoretical framework. Can one of you answer that?
Jen or Nadim, do one of you want to take that one?
Would you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, sorry. How do we link conceptual framework and theoretical framework?
So it's pretty, I think, simple. Whatever you have planned, whatever the concepts behind your study or your study design or study questions, that's where you want to take those and look what's out there in the field already, and you take a question and you plan what's going to happen, what will be the outcome. So based on that, you make a hypothesis and make a theory that this will be the outcome. If we take these 3 steps in our experiments, we'll end up with this. And that's where your conceptual framework will create that theory, and that theory cannot be always right. You may end up having you refute it basically at the end, or you may prove it. So it can go either way. So to summarize it, yes, conceptual framework is like what is your hypothesis is based on that.
Thank you. There was a question here about, so can the results and discussion be combined, especially in a qualitative study?
I can chime in on that. So of course that some of that is field dependent and research dependent, but we do recommend having a separate results section and a separate discussion question. Again, the journal submission guidelines will be the best place to look to see if there's any specifics for that particular field or discipline, but typically those are kept separate.
Thank you, Jessica. We had a question about the length of the introduction. Is there a specific length that we should aim at, and should we include the literature under the introduction?
I can answer that one. I think the introduction really is going to vary based on the journal and the study type. So a good thing to do if you have a journal or a couple journals in mind you're interested in, to look at similar articles and see what the introduction looks like in terms of length, and also check submission guidelines to see if they actually have specific word count limits. Some journals only publish online, so they generally don't have word limits. And you can be a little bit longer, but I think what's really important when you consider the introduction is that while it's meant to be a literature review, it's meant to be a brief literature review, and it's meant to focus on the most important studies in the field that support your study hypothesis and rationale for your study. So I think Nadine may have hinted at this earlier in the webinar, but I think what's really relevant is to focus on the pieces of evidence, if you will, article being a piece of evidence that support your rationale for your study. And you use those to build the argument as to why you did the study, or if it's a review article, it'll still have an introduction, but it might be a little bit more of a summary highlighting seminal articles in the field. And then you actually go into different topics in the review and reference more in detail. So Nadim, I don't know if you have any more to add there.
No, I think you covered pretty much everything. And yeah, if you have, it all depends on the type of the article. If it's a research versus review, so you depend on the type and then focus on those. If it's a review, then you have a lot of literature review. You come up with your own commentary in between, and then if it's a research, then obviously it will based on literature, but then you come up with your own piece of evidence or what you have collected so far and where you are heading, and what further, because science is you answer one question and then there are always 3 more questions to address. So I think that's the purpose of science, is then it's never ending. So you start with addressing one question and then you raise 2 questions for future direction, for future studies.
Thank you both for that. We had a question about whether a paper can be solely based on review of other people's work. Can someone answer that question?
Yeah, I think that's, we just were talking about that review article. You don't have to, and that's what I think people usually encourage young investigators at their early age to start writing by doing writing something, a mini review or a review article where they are using other people's work and comparing what's out there and what's not out there, raising more questions and asking more questions from where's the gap in the field and what's the gap in the field and all different things. And yes, that's the answer is yes, you can do that.
Thank you, Nadeem. We have time for a few more questions. So there was a question related to ethical clearance and whether you need to be linked to an institution in order to gain it. Can someone answer that question?
I don't have a clear answer, but I would think you would need to have ethical clearance from whatever institution you're working with. If you're going to be working with patients, there needs to be, or animals, it needs to be some kind of ethical approval clearance from that institution's approving body.
Yeah, I think that's very right, Jen. You always need a approval from an institutional review board, if it's a human study or animal institution related, that regulatory bodies manages animal work at your institution. So yeah, without that, you cannot move forward, and no journal will publish any data with a proper ethical approval. Approval prior to starting the study. Let's be more careful, clear about that.
Thank you both. I know that there's a common theme here of, all the answers are, it depends on the subject, on the journal, but there's been a few questions about keywords and how to choose them and how many to use and what the purpose of them is. I know that you have covered keywords during the presentation, but would you be able to just tell us a little bit more about the purpose and how many and how to look for them?
So as far as the number of keywords, it probably does depend upon the journal. I think most probably recommend 3 to 5 keywords. The keywords generally shouldn't be words that are found throughout the title or the abstract. And the reason being that the keywords are useful if you're doing searches, especially like in indexing sites like PubMed. They're in addition to the title and the abstract, so they help with discoverability of your article. I know that there's some good SAGE resources we should find maybe to share that do talk a little bit more in detail about why the keywords or how keywords are used and why they're important. But something just as a recommendation, don't make the keywords too generic for the field or too specific to your study. If you're looking for examples, I would recommend looking at keywords of similar articles to your own and see what kind of keywords they're using.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I believe we are actually now out of time. So I'll just answer one of the questions that came up multiple times, which is about a certificate of attendance. We will be sending one to everyone who has attended. So thank you very much for that question. And I will pass it on to Jessica now for final words.
Thank you. Well, a very big thank you to everyone who attended. We will be following up specifically for any questions that were left unanswered. And this, as Maria mentioned, this will be posted so you can watch the recording, review the slides, and have this for reference. We look forward to having you join us for future webinars in the series. A very big thank you to Nadim and Jennifer for joining us today. We're grateful to have you, and see you next time.
Thank you. See you.